Stars Conference. We'll just give it a couple of minutes to let everybody come into the in through the lobby, park their cars, park their bicycles, get themselves sorted with a cup of tea, settle themselves down for the meeting. So welcome. Oh, look at all these people coming into the room. Fantastic. From all around the world as well. I can see all those faces popping up. Fantastic. Great to see you all coming. We'll just give it a couple more minutes whilst everybody settles down and see everyone come in. Not a bad autumn day here in Lancashire today, looking out the window. Bit of sunshine. Had my lunch in the garden before I popped inside for this.
Was that box of snacks that arrived at my door about 5 minutes ago? Is that the conference pack?
That should be.
Oh, good. That's a treat. Thank you. Perfect timing.
Mine's not arriving apparently until 9 o'clock tonight, so. What did you get in your box, Nigel?
Oh, all sorts of chocolates and things and little bags of snacks, and 1 hour later it would arrive during my talk. That would have been even better.
Okay, just waiting for a few more people to arrive. It's great to see everyone popping in and joining us today for the Stars Conference. We'll just give it a couple more minutes to let everyone settle in. I think that Malika is going to go over the etiquette for the program. I think the general idea is probably keep yourself muted unless you're speaking, and if you want to. Probably best you hide your face, but if you want to show yourself, I guess that's fine too. But I guess muted is important, really. We are recording the meeting, which is important that you know that. Other than that, let's wait for everyone to arrive. We'll just give it another. Okay, we're coming up nearly to time now, and I think it's time that I should start. I'll give it another about 30 seconds or so, and then we'll start the welcome. Okay, let's start the meeting. Welcome, everybody. Welcome to the Stars Conference. It's a pleasure to see you all here today from around the world. I've seen people coming in today to the meeting. It's truly exciting. I think what the pandemic has done for us is given us a real sense of opportunity to have an international meeting, and that's what we have before us for the next few days. So how exciting and how great to see you all, and welcome. My name is Phil Haygarth, and I'm the director of the STARS Centre for Doctoral Training. That means that it's a nationwide, a UK-wide centre for training PhD students in soil science. It's been running since 2015, so we're heading towards our 7th year. We will have trained about 40 PhD students. We represent 4 universities from around England, Scotland and Wales, and also 4 research institutes as well. So 8 organisations core represented, but many others as well represented by collaboration or other collaborative interests. And it's great to see everybody here today. So far already, we've, I think, seen about 18 or so PhD students graduated from the STARS National Soils Centre. and we've got others, lining up ready to submit their thesis and graduate and go out to see the soils world and to make their impact on the future of soils and the welfare of the world and whatever. And that's exactly what we want to be doing. So this is really a celebration of soils, a celebration of graduate training, and also a forward look really to some of the opportunities for the world in soil science. Soils in Context is the title, which has been given, and it really celebrates the role of the legacy fellow Malika Mezeli, who's really been instrumental in leading forward the vision for this meeting, and really must take all the credit for taking forward her vision and delivering this impact of this meeting, supported fantastically by Olivia Lawrenson, who supports with the administration and the management of the Doctoral Training Centre as a whole. So a really huge thanks to Malika and Olivia, who've really driven this forward with gusto, with determination and passion. So a big virtual round of applause, please, for Malika and Olivia as we go forward. I'm going to click on the clap button there on Teams and give them a good old proper round of applause. So I think there's many things that I wanted to say, and I'm not going to speak for very long before I hand over to those much more able than I am to contribute. One of the things I wanted to really comment on is the excitement as we look forward into 2022. 2022 for the UK and for UK soil science is a really exciting year, because that's the year that we host the World Congress of Soil Science, and together with our partners and collaborators, the British Society of Soil Science, they will be organising the World Congress of Soil Science in Glasgow, which happens every 4 years in Glasgow next August in 2022. Now that's important for us today and for us as contributors to the STARS conference, because what I'm sure as Malika will tell you more as we go through the week, really part of our vision is to be able to deliver a session at the World Congress of Soil Science next summer. So we've already got our slot booked for the 2nd of August 2022 in Glasgow, when we hope to host you all, not virtually, but in person if you can, in Glasgow, where we will take further forward some of these learnings and reflections from our STARS journey. And it will be great to see you join us there on the 2nd of August next year. So let's just, before I hand over to Malika, some observations and some thoughts from me. This is really exciting in terms of if you look at the agenda, we have keynotes from across the world. We have keynotes that will be represented talking live from Scotland, from England, from Canada, and from the United States through the week. Some real, really well-established, influential, leading soil scientists mixing the debate with the graduate students here this week, which is really exciting. We also have a vision of the Soils in Context debate facilitated by Dee Hennessy. I'm sure Malika will tell you more about that. And also Malika has a fantastic vision for leading towards a high impact publication around the idea of soils and climate change. So plenty of things to do, as well as some, I think some ancillary social activities too, and perhaps even some real get-togethers, as well as some social get-togethers planned in our satellite locations where we are around the nation, or indeed around the world. So I'm going to stop now. That's the end of my intro. Thank you ever so much again for coming today. Thank you to Malika and Olivia for all their leadership. I'm going to step back now and enjoy the conference. So thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you, Phil. Thank you very much. So I'm just going to give you a little bit more of go over very quickly some things that Phil did raise. First, I need to try to successfully share my screen. Okay, so I think that's okay. I think everyone can see my screen now. Can you see the slides or my notes?
Yeah, it's good, Malika. I can see it.
But you can't. Can you see the notes?
I can see the notes too, but it's working.
I think, Malika, what you can do is, instead of sharing your whole screen, you can share the window of your PowerPoint. In this case, we won't be able to see your notes.
It's a good start, isn't it?
If it helps, the notes didn't seem to intrude. It looked fine.
Okay. It's going to be fun, isn't it, for the rest of the few days? Okay, well, thank you, everyone, for coming. And I don't want to repeat what Phil said, but I do want to highlight some things as well about STARS. So since 2016, STARS will go on to train about 40 soil PhD researchers, where UKRI have really actively tried to fill a gap in postgraduate training in soil science specifically. And over this time, STARS has hosted 3 student-led conferences. STARS Legacy is a further funded UKRI project aimed to celebrate, consolidate and synthesise these experiences with a hope to inspire future soil scientists. As STARS CDT comes to an end with our 4th and possibly last conference, I thought we could think about soil science research with a wider perspective. So as well as our usual focused research talks and a series of very welcome keynotes, we'll be creating a platform for all our conference delegates to discuss, workshop and formalise themes introduced by previous STARS conferences, such as how our research can best address global key challenges, thinking around interacting with other disciplines and contextualising soil science research and practice, and more generally the need to assess and reflect on our discipline and practice as a whole. So just as a side note, I've actually found this book, Thinking with Soils, a really valuable read at this point in my career, and it's definitely encouraged me to work with other researchers of soils, and I definitely recommend it to ECRs where it may inspire potential cross-disciplinary conversations and work. So we'll be exploring these themes with 2 series of workshops running over the next few days. The effects of climate change on soils. This is focused on a tangible output made up of 3 90-minute sessions which will reflect on the effects of climate change scenarios on soils. As we're a national consortium of soil scientists, we're really well positioned, I think, to potentially offer some valuable comment on this. And I thought it could be beneficial to bring together our expert delegates in all aspects of soils with the aim of producing a multi-authored manuscript with ambitions for publication in a high-level journal. So I'll share some more information regarding these workshops at the end of the research talk session tomorrow. That's between 9:10 and 10:40. And some of that will have some key details on the effect of climate change scenarios on soils workshops. The second series of workshops, Soils in Context, will encourage the soil scientists to examine their practice. So we've curated a programme of speakers to give carefully selected talks, and each of these talks will be followed by a 90-minute workshop. The workshops will attempt to extract themes introduced by the preceding keynote to identify and incorporate the potential for these to be integrated into the delegates' current work and practice, and to support recommendations on the next best steps for the individual, the group, or as a discipline. These are meant just as an intellectual exercise, and I'm actually really excited just to sort of see what comes out of these sessions, and I hope that they'll be enjoyable. I've posted resources which are publicly available documents in the sessions files on Microsoft Teams here, and they'll mostly be for the climate change topics, and also some additional materials on the resources section on the conference page. And I do apologise that due to some technical issues, the website doesn't have all the functionality we wanted, hence the late introduction, but I do hope it supports you navigating the next few days. So all conference sessions are going to be held on Teams. General posts or anything coming from the organisers. General discussion for everyone, please use the discussion space. And any materials or questions or discussions relating to a particular session, please post within that session. That will also include the Q&As as well for after the specific talks. All the talks will be recorded, but not the workshops. And if anyone would like their session, not like their session recorded, please just let us know in your talk introduction. I believe there might be a couple of people that have some IP issues. So please, as standard, we'll be recording. So please do let us know if you do not want us to record, but none of the workshops will be recorded. All of our workshops will be facilitated by Dee Hennessy, whose expertise, I'm sure, will ensure our discussions and breakouts allow for intellectual and tangible outputs of value. And I'm really excited to see her in action. She's been an absolute pleasure to work with thus far. Maybe not me so much, but we'll see how all of this goes. But I think we're in very capable hands. So also who you're going to have popping in and out of sessions will be our resident artist, Holly. So Holly's currently living in South Germany. She's a visual science communicator and illustrator. She was previously an environmental science student and still has exercised interest in this field, hence her sort of being happy to do this, to do our conference for us. So I think Holly was going to say a couple of words now. So I think I should stop sharing my screen, and I think Holly's going to pop up.
Yes, hello. So I'm very excited to be here. And yes, as Malika mentioned, I'm a visual science communicator. I've been working alongside conferences and communicating various scientific topics for the last 4 years professionally. Previous to that, my background was in environmental geosciences and environmental management. So I will be floating in and out at the back of your workshops during the next few days, listening in on the keynotes, as well as then the discussions that emerge throughout the workshops. And we'll be filling an illustrated visual that you'll receive at the end of the conference. So I can give a little hint of what that's starting to look like. I've got a little layout that we'll be working our way through as we move through the workshops in the next few days. And another series of workshops for the great research talks coming up, and the second set of talks on climate change. So again, if you see me popping into the back of the talks, don't mind me, and I really look forward to hearing everything that you come up with in the next few days. So thank you again, Malika, so much for having me on.
Oh no, thanks so much for joining us. I'm really excited about what you're going to produce. And is there anything, would you like people to have their video on? The participants? Does that help for you?
No, so rather than I won't be drawing participants themselves, but rather capturing the words that you say and the ideas that you come up with visually. So a combination of text and visuals to support it. So not quite with the same, I think, level of detail maybe as minutes, but in a much more visually engaging way that captures the overarching ideas that are emerging from the conversation. So while I will be catching visuals of the organizers and of the keynote speakers, I won't be drawing any participants themselves. So don't worry about having cameras on or off.
Everyone's probably quite happy about that, to be honest with you. All right, thanks very much, Holly.
Yeah,
thanks.
thank you.
I'll just go back to sharing my screen. Let's hope it's a little bit more fluid than last time. Okay, so just a couple of more things before I leave you to Nigel. So tonight from 7, we've got planned a virtual graduation celebration on the rooftop at Gathertown. You can reach the Gathertown space, the STARS Conference Gathertown space, on the website. And the rooftop looks a little something like that. And there's, I think, Olivia and I looking a little bit lonely. And in the Gathertown space, there's also going to be whiteboards to share your ideas about the World Soil Congress that Phil introduced. So any ideas you've got about that for the STARS session at the World Soil Congress in Glasgow 2022. And also about just your general conference experience as well, as a separate whiteboard for that. And I would love to, well, all of us would really love to hear your comments. And I think you can post anonymously. So hopefully you'll be honest as well. And we do apologise for those outside the UK or any latecomers if we weren't able to get a conference pack to you in time. But for those that did, we hope you can bring it to the Gathertown rooftop tonight at 7. We've also got a meetup in Lancaster on Thursday evening. We're going to have dinner and some drinks. If you've got nearby any colleagues, I think Thursday evening would be a great chance to maybe get together physically. I know that the people from BGS are going to try and get together there as well. I believe Martha Ledger's organising something. I will stop sharing now. So just before I introduce Nigel, is there any questions at all? I can't see anything in the comments. Olivia's also put the link for the Gathertown space there in the messages, just in case anyone can't access the site. I've still got a couple of people joining as well. Okay. Okay, so for our first talk, and the first talk in the Soils in Context series, I'd like to introduce Nigel Clark, Chair in Social Sustainability at Lancaster University. So the first time I heard about the Banaba people, I didn't know Nigel very well at the time. He turned around to me, and I think it was an event, a Lancaster event at the Story here. And he asks me if I know anything about phosphorus. And I hear, obviously, can I tell you about phosphorus? And obviously I was very excited for this guy who just discovered this fascinating element maybe a week ago to tell me all about phosphorus. But, you know, I've been quite well primed for those sort of scenarios. But anyway, Nigel did tell me about phosphorus, but it was actually quite interesting. But it wasn't his story. It was actually Katerina Tayawa's. that one of her ancestors, the bonobo. And in this talk, I believe he'll mostly be taking from Katerina's book, Consuming Ocean Island, Stories of People and Phosphate from the Bonobo. So I've provided a link to this in the resources section on the website, and some other sort of additional material as well that sort of complements Nigel's work. Her work provides some of the source material as well for a piece in his most recent book, Planetary Social Thought, The Anthropocene Challenge to the Social Sciences. But, and I quote, goes off on far too many tangents. That was Nigel Clark in unofficial comments several weeks ago. But also in other quotes, works to redefine the very sense of the social and allow the planet to take its place in the contested space of social entities. He's been accused or possibly applauded with soiling the social. But I thought he would make an interesting first speaker for our conference. So this is Nigel Clark, and he's going to be talking about phosphate colonialism and the making of a Grassland Revolution. So Nigel, can we see you? Hello.
Okay, I think you hear me and you can see me, and now I'll do the screen sharing thing. Thanks, Malika.
You do it.
This will take a minute or two just to sort out, I think. You can see something starting to happen. Starting to see something. Thanks for the intro, Malika. I think the event you were talking about was the 350th birthday party of Phosphorus, which I gate crashed and learned a lot there. I thought you were going to kind of out me for mansplaining, but I just about got it.
No, I thought you were. No, this was actually prior to that one. I can't remember what it was.
Okay.
It was a good couple of years ago. And I thought you were going to be guilty of mansplaining, but no, you didn't. You didn't.
Well, that's a great relief. Are you seeing my slides now? Is that looking okay?
Yeah, all
right.
good.
Okay, so what I'm going to do in this talk, I'm just going to start off with a little bit of kind of the science context, but I'm going to rush over that really quickly because I know full well most of you, if not all of you, know a great deal more about that than me. So it's just covering some things that I've recently discovered. Then I'm going to give you the main bit of the talk, which is the phosphate colonialism story, which is really quite self-indulgent because this is my story coming from Aotearoa, New Zealand, my kind of story of growing up and how, phosphate benefited me. Then the last third, I'm just going to look at some of the questions raised by this, and they're really questions around colonization and the phosphate colonies that we exploited, and some of the connections that follow from that. And you're probably going to think he doesn't really know how to end this talk, and that's really quite true, because there's a whole lot of issues that come up through my entanglement, New Zealand's entanglement with these small Pacific phosphate colonies that really have no great resolution, no answer. They can't really be resolved. So the story doesn't ever really end. So I'll be opening up a few issues, opening up a few questions, but really they're not questions that you can answer. There's no particular lessons I want you to take out of this. They're more just questions that I want you to think about and have in mind. And I know that you're from all across the planet. So some of you may come from places that have very, very similar issues than the ones I'm talking about. So you might well have your own version of these. So let's get into the thick of it. One of the things I've been doing a lot of work on is the Anthropocene and engaging with the notion of planetary boundaries. And this kind of drew me into the idea of it's not just climate change, it's not just extinction. There are biogeochemical flows and cycles that I really didn't know a great deal about. And as Malika mentioned, I discovered the phosphorus cycle fairly recently. But it really felt to me like something as a social scientist that I really, really needed to know about and really need to know more about. And especially because it is so relevant to where I come from. So I'm aware that there's been some conversations around phosphorus passing peak availability, a little bit like kind of peak fossil fuel. But then questions that the more urgent problem is runoff, agricultural fertilization and sewage runoff, eutrophication, and even the possibility of going over some sort of planetary boundary, some sort of transgression on a planetary scale. And again, I'm aware that that's debated, whether eutrophication is mostly a more kind of regional problem, or whether it could possibly join up, cascade, and become something going over a planetary boundary, going over a threshold. And again, I'm aware this has been debated, but as a social scientist, if there's thresholds in the Earth system, I really want to know about them, right? These are things that we all need to know about, whatever discipline we're coming from. Climate change was the same thing for me, realizing that the global climate system could go over a threshold into a new operating state really made me kind of want to think again about what it meant to be a social scientist. So coming from the social sciences, there's been quite a bit of criticism about the Anthropocene. Criticism, the idea that it's a single worldview, that it's disembodied, that it's scientists talking on behalf of the rest of the world. It's been criticized as a grand narrative of undifferentiated humanity. I think these critiques are a little bit kind of overstated. I think there's something really important coming out of them, which is that where we're speaking from matters. It matters where we're positioned, where we're placed, where we've come from, the experiences we've had. They're really important. But these things, I think, for me, complement thinking on the planetary or the global scale, rather than a playoff of one or the other. So I'm really keen in thinking that moves backwards and forwards between the grander planetary scale and the more kind of localized scale. So what I'll be doing in the talk is really giving you a version that brings local people's experience, into the story, and really starts, I think, to shift some of the ways that we think about these big issues. So the science studies scholar Donna Haraway talks about the only way to find a larger vision is to be somewhere in particular. But she's still talking about building up to a larger vision. And that's the bit that I think is just as important as the view from somewhere, the more local or situated view. Okay, so phosphate and me. How mineral phosphate helped make me who I am. This is where I'm from, Aotearoa, New Zealand. This is home for me. And it's only really in the last decade or so that I've figured out just how much of my way of life, my upbringing, was dependent on phosphate and on mineral phosphate. Just what a huge difference it made to the opportunities that I had growing up. So growing up in New Zealand in the 60s and 70s, New Zealand was one of the wealthiest countries in the world. Didn't feel like that, felt kind of dull, but we had a really robust social welfare system, high employment, free healthcare, extensive state housing, and even free education all the way up to tertiary. So I hate to say this to those of you studying now, but I had free education almost, right into my PhD. Where did this come from? Really funded by export-oriented pastoral farming. This is what made New Zealand wealthy, exporting sheep, cattle, wool. So the environmental historian Gregory Cushman, he talks about a grassland revolution that took place in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. Allowed Australians and New Zealanders to eat high on the food chain and enjoy some of the best living standards in the world. And that's really basically, that's my upbringing he's talking about. It wasn't always this way, and as soil scientists, you'll kind of know this. A lot of other people still think that New Zealand is this sort of infinitely green and fertile land. New Zealand soil lacked vital nutrients for sustained pastoral farming, especially when there's a lot of overstocking and farmers are trying to get the maximum amount out of their land. By the late 19th, early 20th century, there's declining soil fertility, severe erosion. A lot of the soil in New Zealand is simply washing off into the Pacific. By the 1930s, this fear that the whole kind of grassland economy, the whole empire of grass might be falling apart, it might be collapsing. So real concern about where New Zealand agriculture is going to. How do they get out of this? Well, it took a lot of fertilizer, state-led response, intensification of artificial supplementing of vital soil nutrients. Superphosphate, mineral phosphate treated with acid to speed its release into the soil. Superphosphate was the big one that made most of the difference in New Zealand. There's also the question of how do you distribute an awful lot of fertilizer over countryside, particularly hilly countryside. And the way this was done in New Zealand, somewhere in the 1940s, mid-1940s, just after World War II, we had some pilots came back from World War II. They were a bit bored. They didn't quite know what to do with themselves. There were some spare training planes, these double-wing, I think they were gypsy moths. Somebody had the idea that you could fill up an airplane with fertilizer and use the plane to distribute that over wide areas of land, particularly over hill country. And it took off. It was a kind of crazy thing to do. There was an awful lot of crashes took place. There was an awful lot of learning that happened. But by and large, it was a fairly successful way of distributing a lot of superphosphate over a big area. And it really did make a difference to the New Zealand economy. And then it spread to Australia, and then it spread around much of the rest of the world. So I gather that by the mid-60s, about half the agrochemical fertilizer used worldwide was dropped from aircraft. So there's a kind of interesting link there by something that started off very local, started off as a crazy experiment someone was doing in the New Zealand countryside, gradually took off literally, and is now impacted, globally. And part of that whole question about an impact on the phosphorus cycle really comes from something that began local, that became eventually something with planetary significance. Of course, the trade in mineral phosphate, the application of mineral phosphate to farmland goes back a long way. From the 1840s, increased demand for phosphate in farming, booming trade in guano, bird shit sourced from the coastal islands of Peru. But another part of the story that's really important is just that this was the hard labor, the work was mostly done by indentured laborers, mostly coming from China. So horrific working conditions, on these islands. A great many of them never made it back to China. A great many of them committed suicide because they were so homesick and they were so appallingly treated. So already the story has a kind of a dark undercurrent that there is some horrific colonial exploitation taking place. And we shouldn't forget that part of the story. The version in New Zealand and Australia was slightly different. The mineral phosphate that was used in New Zealand mostly came from two small islands in the Pacific, Nauru and Banaba. It was discovered, and we use that term guardedly by colonial prospectors, that these islands were mostly composed of mineral phosphate. Around 1900, they discovered what was, of course, already known to the people that lived there, that they lived on this rich island. The phosphate in these islands is not the guano birdshit version. It's microscopic marine life depositing waste products over millions of years. Quick version, again, I think you would probably understand this far better than I do, but it's kind of fascinating to me how these islands came into existence. The thing about the mining of phosphate on Nauru and Banaba is that it literally made these islands uninhabitable and totally destroyed local ways of life. So the people of Nauru, Banaba, these small, what became known as phosphate colonies, they're still trying to get compensation for the destruction of their islands. It's been a very, very long story, and it's still not resolved. One of the shocking things about it is that colonial administrators knew right from the beginning that those islands would become uninhabitable. So this is a colonial administrator, 1909, a mere 9 years after the discovery of phosphate. the island would become perfectly uninhabitable for men, a mere desert of pointed coral rocks. And he was spot on, because that was exactly how Banaba and Nauru ended up. People describe them as being like a moonscape, literally nothing living left in the kind of the heart, the center of these islands. It's even more disturbing when you think about what was left. The only place that remains habitable around these little islands is really just the bit around the edge, which is also the part of the islands most threatened by sea level rise. So creating an extremely difficult, unending problem. Here again is the Sydney Morning Herald, 1912, completely justifying, finding a way to justify making these islands uninhabitable. It's inconceivable that less than 500 ocean island-born natives, that's the old name for Banaba, can be allowed to prevent the mining and export of a product of such immense value to all the rest of mankind. So basically, in one sentence, summing up the logic of colonization and colonialism, the people who live there just have to sacrifice the things they've got for the rest of us, which really means, the wealth of the West. So Malika mentioned that I'm drawing a lot on the work of Katerina Teiwa. She's an anthropologist. Her father is originally from Banaba, so her interest is really coming from this region, coming from that island, and really living through with the experience of the afterlife of being a phosphate colony. What happened to the people of Banaba? Eventually they were relocated about 1,200 miles away, the island of Rambi in Fiji, completely different island, different climate, different people they were living alongside, because their island had become uninhabitable. I think that's where Katerina would have grown up. So I've learned an awful lot about this, and particularly about the phosphate colonialism question, by reading her work. So very much reliant on her thinking. And what I really like about her work is the many different angles she brings to it. She knows the science, she's studied up on phosphorus, but she also tells a story of what it's like to live with the recognition that your island, your ancestors, your soil has been turned into somebody else's wealth. So there's a nice little story she tells from the 1970s that Banaba Islanders were visiting New Zealand. They were a dance group. They'd come to perform their local dances. They were on a bus trip. They were shown, well, that airplane is dropping fertilizer, and that fertilizer is your island. So a real kind of wake-up moment for these people. The bus driver told us it was superphosphate from Ocean Island, that's Banaba. That made us feel sad and stirred our hearts. It seems that some of Banaba is in New Zealand. So that realization of these visitors, these visiting people in the Pacific Islands, that their land was being spread all over the landscape, the countryside of New Zealand. Here's a slightly more politicized version of the same story. This is Ken Segra. He's an activist from Banaba. He's telling the same story, but in a slightly more assertive way. Where is Banaba? Banaba is all over Australia, New Zealand, and everywhere else in the world, being used as phosphate. So where is my country? Where is my island? So this is really what I'm starting to realize I've lived with. It's made me who I am. I'm the one who's benefited from this, and a lot of my fellow country people. And the way Katerina Teiwa explains it, the concept of te aba, or land, unites the body of land with the bodies of people. So land, very, very important in the Pacific. So is the sea, very, very important in the Pacific. But the sense that the land and the body, the land and the ancestors are really part and parcel of the same thing. But as she said in an interview, the body of the people is in that landscape. So when it's mined and crushed and dug up, you're not just doing it with rock, you're also doing it with people, with the remains of people. So when we think about the mineral phosphate being distributed all over New Zealand, Australia, from her point of view, the point of view of the people of Banaba or Nauru, it's also distributing their ancestors, in a sense. So in a sense, there's a spirit in that soil. It's not just the element, it's not just the mineral. So what does this mean for me? What does this mean for the way we think about the relationships forged through phosphate colonialism? What might it mean, opening it up even more, for thinking more generally about soil, thinking about soil in a time of rapid global environmental change, in a time of going over threshold, in a time of going over planetary boundaries, whether it's in biogeochemical cycles or whether it's to do with climate. What might this mean? How might this inform or shake up the way we think about these issues, these challenges? And this is where things kind of open up. This is where things get a little unresolved, because these are not issues that you can identify a solution or an answer to. I think for me, they're an incitement. They provoke or incite new ways of thinking, but they don't necessarily lead us towards a resolution. And really, this is, a lot of you will be aware of the whole question of decolonizing science, social science, natural science, decolonizing our institutions. And really, this is a version of engaging with colonialism, raising that whole question of decolonization, which isn't really a question that has a simple answer or a resolution to it. So some debts can be addressed, even if they can't properly ever be settled. You can pay compensation if others have lost something, if they've lost land or resources. So the Banabans took the UK to court. It was one of the longest court cases in British history. They finally won in 1979, basically about the fact they weren't paid properly, adequately for their phosphate, but also the fact that the island was not, reforested. It wasn't replanted. They were awarded £9,000. Their court costs were £300,000, so that's hardly a settlement. There was quite a lot of political controversy over this. Eventually, the UK government backed down, set up a trust fund of 6.5 million to support the Banaban community. But 6.5 million compared with the value of all the phosphate and the loss of an island and a way of life really can go nowhere towards, settling that debt. So the debt, in a sense, is still there. And of course, we need to think about how we engage with biogeochemical flows, the whole question of mitigating eutrophication. Again, that's more your field than my field, so I'm just going to leave that one in the background, but we don't want to kind of overlook this as a vital issue that needs attention and to a certain degree at least has the possibility of some kind of resolution. But let's come back to this really tricky question about this being somebody else's land with somebody else's spirit in it. So Bron Jasinski and I in our book talked about this a little bit, the question of what it meant when minerals are infused with the ancestral spirit of somebody else, when they work their way into our economies, into our soil, into our water bodies, but also into our very flesh and blood as living beings, that somebody else's resources, but somebody else's spirit is there in our economies, in our bodies. And this is starting to really show up in politics, in global politics, because more and more indigenous or colonized peoples are saying, you took our land, but with this, there's something else that went on. It wasn't just land, it wasn't just resources. This is about our ancestors. This is about our spirit. This is about the gods we believe in. So in a strange kind of way, these other beings, deities, ancestors, spirits, are starting to work their way into global environmental politics. But in some ways, this is not, I think, for those of us living in this part of the world, it's not entirely unfamiliar. You think about Rupert Brooke. I don't know if you still read his poetry in schools. He's kind of the poster boy of posh dead poets from World War One. If I should die, think only this of me, that there's a corner of a foreign field that is forever England. There shall be in that rich earth a richer dust concealed, and so on. So he's kind of saying something quite similar to those Pacific Islanders about soil containing something of the spirit of the people who died there. Interestingly, he actually spent the happiest year of his life, 1913, traveling around the Pacific, doing the sort of mischief that posh white guys did in the Pacific. But there's a kind of chance that there's already some of the Pacific in that poem, because he traveled to Tahiti, Samoa, Fiji, spent 7 months in the Pacific. So in his foreign field, there may already be a bit of the Pacific there. It's also interesting that in the 19th century, there was a bit of an outcry that it was realized that they were digging up, that fertilizer companies were digging up the bones of soldiers and horses who'd died in the Napoleonic Wars, Battle of Waterloo and so on, taking them back to Britain and reprocessing them into fertilizer. And basically a Yorkshire newspaper blew the story, criticizing the practice, and only then was the practice, I think, stopped. So interestingly, there's also a similar kind of concern about ancestors' bodies, reusing them, for fertilizer, for instrumental purposes. So in some ways, I think some parallels between the way we talk about, experience things in Europe and the Pacific and other parts of the world. So we shouldn't think of these as being complete opposites or a kind of a binary difference. It's also interesting that something that Katerina Teiwa does is that she also finds in her study of phosphate and in her study of the history of using superphosphate in New Zealand and Australia, that often the story of what superphosphate can achieve is told as a kind of a magical story itself. So people referring to superphosphate as the magic dust of Australian or New Zealand agriculture. Novelist writing about this, she talks about superphosphate, there can be no doubting the magic of it. And I still kind of remember that in New Zealand, people talked about putting this stuff on their veggie gardens. And there almost was this kind of sense of it having almost kind of like magical properties. So again, what Katerina Teiwa is trying to do is to kind of, I think, destabilize, blur the difference between the way we think about these things in the West and the way people in the Pacific think about these issues. But another side of this, which for me is really fascinating. This is a troubling story. It's a difficult story. It's a story about people losing their land, losing their way of life, losing their ancestors in a sense. But also the way Katerina Teiwa tells the story, it's also got a kind of an element of a kind of poetry to it. She talks about the rock of Banaba being split into 20 million tons of tiny particles spread out over the entire planet. The island fracturing into pieces, moving across the ocean, creating and breaking countless relationships between people, places, and products. She talks about this as being a literal kind of cross-fertilization. So her island, the phosphate from her island, the spirit of her ancestors, is also making connections. It's connecting up people in that part of the world, in the Pacific, with people in New Zealand, with people in Australia, with people in Britain. It's creating this entire kind of network in which those of us who were raised on this mineral phosphate, those of us whose way of life has benefited from it, have this kind of connection, this entanglement with these people that we never knew we were connected with. So one of the things that she's doing in this story is really exploring this kind of connectivity between her little island and the rest of the planet. So she's taking this very local, small, this tiny island, and showing how it became global, how it became planetary, how it linked her people in with this entire kind of planetary process and global processes, both physical and social. So there's also, in a way, I think, it gives us new ways of thinking about connectivity. It gives us a new way of thinking about the debts and the things that we owe others, and thinking about the things that connect us up with other people. So one way to think about this is our debt to the bodies that came before us. So all of us as human beings or living things owe a debt to the bodies who've come before, all the way back to, you know, the people we evolved from, the communities we come from, the parents, the families, the kin who brought us up. This is an Australian philosopher, Elizabeth Gross, talking about this idea of a debt, where we came from, the element through which all living things are born and live, a cosmological element, and the specific body, a chain of bodies from which we come. You know, life is this double or this multiple debt to all these other bodies. So where does this leave me as someone whose family originally came from England and Ireland, who grew up in Aotearoa, New Zealand? What debt do I owe to different bodies? So there's a possibility for me that you know, my bones, my flesh, coming from, grown by in part this mineral phosphate, you know, maybe somewhere in that there are the bodies of the people who fell in the Napoleonic Wars. Maybe somewhere in that, in me, in who I am, there's also those indentured Chinese laborers who worked and gave their lives in the phosphate colonies of the East Pacific, on the Guano Islands. And very definitely, there is the land, the spirit, the resources of the people of Banaba and Nauru. So in a way, all those past experiences, all those chains of bodies going into the past have helped make me and, you know, the rest of New Zealand, you know, who and what we are. So there's a strange kind of sense of that entanglement again with other bodies that's actually in a way kind of written into our bodies, written into our flesh and our bones. Okay, so just winding up, as I suggested, these are questions that don't have necessarily endings, resolutions. They open up issues, they open up questions. We can't necessarily resolve them, and maybe we don't want to resolve them. They're things that we kind of have to live with and live through. But for me, it's kind of interesting to think about these questions, particularly at a time when we're thinking about crossing planetary boundaries. We're thinking about questions of passing over thresholds into a very different Earth system, a very unfamiliar Earth system. And I think there's things that we can learn from these stories. And one of them is that as we're heading into this kind of crisis situation, that as scientists, whether we're social or natural scientists, we have to deal with anxiety, loss, and grief as well. We have to deal with these intense questions of what we value and the meaning of the materials or the life forms that we work with. And for me, there's a possibility of learning from and being inspired by those other people, colonized people, who've had to live through the end of their world. They managed to live through it. They managed to find a way through it. They managed to find new ways of telling stories, of narrating their experience. And I think there's a lot that we can learn from those experiences. I think they're difficult stories. They're stories of injustice. They're stories of exploitation. But what I love about Katerina Teiwa's stories, and she's an art curator as well. She's also a very, very keen Pacific dancer, a very keen dancer. So she thinks poetically and imaginatively around these questions. They are also things that we can be creative around. They're not just things that should, I think, paralyze us with guilt or anxiety. They also offer us new ways of thinking how we're connected with other people in other places. So I love that idea, literally and figuratively, of cross-fertilization of people in very different places, people in different times, cross-fertilization really over time or over time zones, but also cross-fertilization between different kinds of beings, a whole range of different beings, whether it's the sheep, the cattle, the seabirds, the microorganisms, but also the other kinds of beings, the ancestors, the spirits, the earth beings, thinking also of that cross-fertilization of those different kinds of beings. So these are some of the questions that I take away from the mineral phosphate colonization story, that I take away from the work of people like Katerina Teiwa, but which I really don't, I'm still wondering where to take them, what to do with them next. I don't feel I've kind of resolved them. They're questions that kind of haunt me, but also they're questions that inspire me as I think about, passing into a very, very different and a very unknown, unfamiliar world. So I will finish up there, and thank you for listening, and thank you for indulging me in talking about my home country. Thanks. Is it over back to you again, Malika?
Yeah, sorry, I also can't unmute my mic properly. Yeah, no, thanks very much. That was fascinating. That was a great little opener. And I would like to, first of all, I'd like to really apologise to everyone that we started early. I should have maybe scheduled a little break before Nigel, so we started on time at 1:40, which is sort of, yeah, I panicked and kind of went straight on. So I do apologise to those. Also, I believe some people are having issues with seeing slides or seeing the chat function. Now, we've got someone working on that in the background, someone, and Olivia, and I don't know what to do about that at the moment. We've put Nigel's slides up in the files section in Teams. So you'd be able to see those there. If you can't ask questions in the chat function, please just email me them or raise your hand in this session. I've also got my email here open, so you can just email me those questions. But Phil's actually got his hand up. So I might go straight to Phil, unless anyone has got any. I presume the people that have got technical issues also can't really turn their microphone on now and ask me. I just thought we might be able to resolve some of those now for you. Okay. All right, Phil, do you want to unmute and speak up?
Hello, Malika. Hello, Nigel. Really enjoyed your talk there. A really great provocative narrative and quite a radical way to open a soils conference, really. A very brave position you take, and I can completely understand your narrative and find it really interesting, and and take it take it and think a lot about it. I suppose really what I wanted to raise is someone who's just written my own book on phosphorus and thought a lot about that as well. I suppose really just to raise the debate back at you, you do cast an understandably dark narrative, but there is also there is a perhaps I think perhaps a more positive way of looking at the narrative as well. I mean, I'm not arguing with anything that you say as such, but I suppose I just wanted to sort of reflect that not all rock phosphate has come at the expense of environmental damage. Not all rock phosphate has done bad, and in fact, as you said, it has really been part of the green revolution and really helped feed loads of people. I suppose I just wanted to sort of balance that really. There there are many dark issues we have to grapple with phosphorus, but there are also loads of good things that it has done for us too. Yeah, I mean, that's a kind of the main thing I wanted to say, really, just to sort of strike a balance. Really loved it. Wanted to strike a balance, but back to the dark side for a moment. Did you know that when I was researching my sort of the history of rock phosphate for the book with Jim Elser, one of the things that I came across in the book was, did you know that they used to scavenge the bones of soldiers to make rock phosphate from battlefields, not that many decades ago, believe it or not. That is a very dark story as well. Anyway, but just a few reflections, really. I'm trying to actually be positive. It's not all, I mean, it's terrible what's happened, but there are also some real good stuff being done too. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, thanks, Phil. I was aware that the bit I talked about the phosphate from the battlefields in the 1860s. I didn't know they kind of carried on doing that. I'm sort of surprised they got away with it. That's fairly perturbing. But no, thanks too for the positive spin on it. And really, in a way, for me, the kind of the positive spin was my whole way of life. You know, growing up in one of the richest countries on earth. So I mean, there's an awful lot of positivity there. It got me through university, halfway through my PhD, without ever paying for anything, because this was really still off the back of New Zealand's pastoral export economy. So in that sense, I'm not complaining. I'm just trying to find ways of dealing with it. But what I really like about Katerina Teiwa's story is that, as well as the colonialism, the injustice, the exploitation, there is kind of a bit of magic in that story as well. And it's a positive story also of what was done, what could have been done with that phosphate. But it's also a story about new kinds of connections between people here and there. I think that's also a story that has a real kind of positive spin to it. That being said, I still would not have wanted to have been an indentured labourer on those islands off the coast of Peru, because that looked like hell.
Microphone, Phil.
Yeah, if I could just come back, Malika. Also, of course, in the context of a soils conference, there is lots of really helpful things that soil can do to as we look forward to the next 100 years and beyond. There are lots of things that the community of these soils graduates can do to really make us be more mindful of how we use the soil to control these solutions, really, for our future, and to right the wrongs, perhaps right some of the wrongs of the past. What was it? One of your quotes you said there was about debt or something. And in a way, the graduates of soil, we can use phosphate much more efficiently. There is so much soil science to be done to do that. So I'm, again, trying to be positive from the story. I'll shut up now.
No, thank you, Phil. Thank you.
Be great to hear some others.
Yeah, no, please, if anyone's got any questions, you can post them in the chat, or if you're having an issue with the chat, you can just raise your hand. If you're having trouble raising your hand, you can send me an email. That's quite a quick thing to do. I was actually surprised by your positivity, in the sense of kind of a sense of accepting the exchange of resources, or these, by looking at the wider timescales as well, that in a sense these exchanges are inevitable, whether it's between humans or just within the planet. And we know, I think, as soil scientists or biologists, as chemists, this happens all the time in the natural world. And I think it gives us, especially in our climate change discussions, gives us a lot more hope for mitigation, in a sense.
Yeah, and I think that the kind of slightly spiritual spin that there was in my story, which I have to admit, when some friends from New Zealand heard me doing a version of this in Australia, they were horrified that I'd gone all spiritual, my old Marxist friends. But I think that there's also, when we layer in the other beings, layer in the ancestors, that can also be, you know, part of the mitigation story. And I'm thinking of our colleague John Child's research that he did about seabed mining off the coast of New Guinea, where there's a possibility that some of those minerals, and again, that this is the ancestral sea of the local people, they're not too happy about it, but there's a possibility that, again, what they see as their ancestral spirit, it's going to end up in our solar panels and in our wind turbines. So again, that strange entanglement of you know, spirited matter, it's not just there in the soils, it's turning up everywhere. It's turning up everywhere where there's minerals. It's turning up everywhere where ores are used. That this is, you know, somebody's ancestors. And there's a sense in which, you know, all our mitigation strategies, there's also this kind of other element, which is very hard to put a finger on, that's kind of murmuring away in you know, in these practices and processes of mitigation. These kind of other lurking beings who are starting to pop up in different ways in environmental politics.
Thank you. I really want to make sure that I give everyone a proper opportunity to ask a question. Well, I've got you. Nigel will also be joining the workshop as well this afternoon. That starts at 1:40. And the first of the soils and context workshops with Dee will be facilitating, and we'll be focusing on some of the themes that Nigel rose. And I think I'll be quite happy for that opportunity to sort of have a little more time to reflect as well and come back with you. One thing as well I wanted to ask you about, and I don't know if you, maybe this isn't really what you do, but do you, I guess with this joining, I suppose, of the natural and the social, is there a danger of you also therefore mitigating human responsibility for human grief to a degree?
Yeah, interesting question. I mean, I'm just really interested in the way that different elements and forces and processes that we make use of, that we kind of join forces with, they work with and through us. And I think there's always the question of how we choose to use them. We don't always have a choice. Sometimes they just kind of work through us. So in some respects, it's kind of like rather than it being less about responsibility, it's a kind of an enlarging of responsibility that draws us into these bigger communities that are not only just living communities. And I guess, you know, you're working, thinking with soil, you know, that we're always part of these kind of larger communities. And I think of it more as a kind of an extension. It's a complicating of responsibility. It's an extension, but I don't think it's a kind of a giving away of responsibility. Though I have got in trouble precisely from other social scientists for doing just that, and you know, being, you know, for the fact that I take away too much from human agency and I redistribute it someplace else that's not human, and that gets me into a lot of trouble with you know, certain kinds of social scientists. So I still get taken to task for doing that. And the reason I quoted Christoph Bonwell, because he held me up as the worst possible example of a social scientist naturalizing their story and running off away from the human agency that we can and should be able to do differently. So for me, there's always a kind of like an excess of the physical world that works through us, that kind of animates us, but is beyond what we can control in a way. There's always a part that kind of exceeds what we can understand, what we can do, what we can do differently. There's an awful lot we can do differently, that we can work with in other ways, but there's always, for me, this kind of excess that works with and through us. That's, you know, as well as what we can simply change or transform. But it gets all the time.
Yeah, because I just think, you know, if I'm thinking of a sort of synergistic or a parasitic, and even then when we're talking about certain organisms or fungi, You know, even that word, you know, where is it synergistic or is it a parasitic relationship is often debated. But then also I rarely call upon that fungi, you know. I mean, yeah, we're talking about human agency as well, but yeah, as we start incorporating the human into the natural, at what point those responsibilities relinquished as well. Thank you. So that ends our Q&A with Nigel. If I haven't had any more questions through, I do hope people are being able to post their questions. I've been trying to address the technical issues that I've been getting through on various streams of communication during this session. Nigel, we put your talks up, we put your slides up in the file section. Is that okay?
That's fine. Yeah.
Just because some people weren't able to see them. So we have a little bit of a short break now, and we come back at 2:40 for the workshop based on this talk. And it'll be in the same session. Okay.